Hey guys! Tonight we're diving deep into one of the most unexpected sources of power in ancient China, the humble salt. Yeah, you heard me right. Salt. That stuff you probably toss on your fries or use to make your soup taste less sad. But before you get too comfortable, imagine a time when this ordinary substance was so valuable. Entire armies fought over it. And empires were built on its trade. And no, this isn't some fancy fantasy story. This is history, and you probably won't survive this unless you can handle the idea of a whole dynasty raking in wealth and power thanks to what's in your kitchen cupboard. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I like to know where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BC to 220 AD. Was one of the most remarkable periods in Chinese history. The vast empire was freshly stabilized after years of turmoil, and the Han were ready to assert their control. But how exactly do you maintain such a massive empire without your fingers in too many pies? That's where salt came in. If you picture the Han Dynasty as a well-oiled machine, salt was like the grease, essential, yet often overlooked. It was needed in almost every facet of life, from preserving food to fueling industry. And the Han, ever the opportunists, realized it was more than just an everyday commodity. It was a powerful economic tool. Imagine being able to control something that's essential to survival. Something you could tax and regulate. Suddenly, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was the backbone of an empire. Alright, now that you're warmed up, let's get to the good stuff, the salt tax itself. So picture this. You're in ancient China, and you've just been told that your daily salt, something so basic you never thought twice about it, is now under the watchful eyes of the state. Sounds a little intense, right? The Han Dynasty didn't just let anyone get their hands on salt. In fact, they monopolized it. That's right, they controlled it. It wasn't like modern-day markets where you could just stroll in and buy a bag for a couple of coins. No, the salt trade was in the hands of the government. And they taxed it with the kind of dedication you usually reserve for keeping track of your Netflix subscription. You see, the Han realized early on that controlling salt could give them a steady stream of revenue without causing too much backlash. They did it in a couple of different ways. First, they established salt production operations, huge salt mines in the empire. Controlled by the government, these mines were managed by state officials who oversaw the workers and collected the salt. And then, they sold it. They taxed every grain, every block, every shipment of salt leaving the mine. Salt was extracted, taxed, and redistributed all over China, providing the government with a constant stream of cash to fund their operations. Of course, it wasn't just about making money. Salt was vital for preserving food. Especially in a land as vast as China, where agriculture varied by region. So by making it scarce and taxing it, the Han could wield enormous power over both the population and neighboring kingdoms. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Historians still argue whether the salt monopoly was the ultimate cause of several peasant uprisings during the later years of the Han Dynasty. Some say it was the overly strict control that led to the resentment. while others suggest the dissatisfaction was more related to the harshness of the taxes themselves. One thing's for sure, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was a weapon. Now that you've got a grip on how the Han Dynasty's salt monopoly worked, let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture. Why on earth would the Han government go through all this trouble for something as simple as salt? I mean, sure, it's useful for food preservation. But surely there were more important things in the empire to worry about. Right? Well, here's where things get interesting. Salt, in the ancient world, was considered a highly valuable resource. It wasn't just seasoning, it was essential for life. Without it, you couldn't preserve meat, fish, or vegetables. You couldn't even keep your food from spoiling during long trips. Salt was, in a way, an ancient form of refrigeration. But the Han didn't stop at just producing salt. They set up an entire bureaucracy to manage its collection, distribution, and taxation. They even had officials called salt commissioners, who were responsible for ensuring that the salt trade was running smoothly and that people were paying their fair share. Can you imagine? A whole division of the government dedicated to making sure the peasants weren't getting away with cheap salt. It's almost funny how much energy they put into something that's now just a supermarket staple. The salt monopoly was one of the pillars of the Han's economic system, providing them with a steady stream of income that funded everything from military expeditions to public works projects. But it wasn't just about filling the imperial coffers. The government was smart enough to use the salt trade to keep its citizens in check. Remember, salt wasn't just a luxury item, it was a necessity. If you controlled the salt, you controlled the people. If you were a merchant or a farmer in ancient China, being able to access salt was a matter of life and death. And the Han knew this all too well. By placing the salt trade in the hands of the government, they ensured that they could exert control over trade routes, markets, and ultimately, the lives of millions of people. It was, in a way, one of the earliest forms of using economics as a form of control. Historians still argue about how much influence the salt tax had over social structures and class divisions during this period. Some say it perpetuated inequality, while others believe it simply reflected the hierarchical nature of ancient China. As we dig deeper into the Han Dynasty's control over salt, you'll start to notice how this seemingly humble commodity was tied up with so many layers of governance, power, and even survival. Salt wasn't just a symbol of the emperor's power over trade. It was also deeply linked with the vast networks of labor that made up the foundation of the empire. You see, to harvest salt in ancient China, especially the way the Han did it, was no simple task. The salt production process involved tons of back-breaking work. And it wasn't just a handful of merchants running around with bags of salt on their backs. No, the Han Dynasty established large-scale salt production operations, particularly along the coasts and in the areas where saltwater could be evaporated to create salt. This meant that there were whole groups of people dedicated to this work. And the government essentially owned the land where salt was produced. Workers weren't paid in the traditional sense. They were paid with food, housing, and, you guessed it, salt. It was the classic barter system, with salt as the most valuable currency of all. Let's not forget that the imperial government didn't just control who could produce salt, they also controlled who could sell it. And that's where things started to get even more interesting. Only authorized merchants were allowed to sell salt to the masses. If you wanted to make a profit off salt, you had to go through the government. And just like that, the state was taking a cut from every transaction, every grain of salt that passed from one hand to another. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you. If you were a salt merchant in ancient China, you had to carry around something called a salt license, which, let's be honest, sounds a lot more glamorous than it probably was. But this was the only way you could legally sell salt. And if you were caught selling without one, you'd face severe punishment. It wasn't just a fine, it could be death or exile. The state was serious about keeping its monopoly intact. Historians still debate how harsh the punishments for illegal salt selling actually were, with some suggesting that there was a kind of underground market that thrived despite these laws. As time went on, the government even started experimenting with different ways to regulate the salt trade. Some provinces saw the rise of salt workshops where workers were employed to make salt bricks, which were then sold at a fixed price. These bricks were standardized so that there was no variation in the price or quality of salt. Control. By the end of the Han Dynasty, the salt monopoly had become a fixture of the empire. It wasn't just about economics anymore, it was about the empire's survival. A disruption in the salt trade could throw the entire empire into chaos. And so, the Han invested heavily in maintaining control over salt production and distribution. Historians argue whether the sheer weight of salt's economic and political power eventually contributed to the fall of the dynasty. Some believe that it solidified the power of the central government, while others suggest it may have exacerbated class tensions and unrest. You're probably starting to see the true scope of how deeply salt was woven into the very fabric of the Han Dynasty's economy. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Salt wasn't just about wealth, it was about control and stability. The salt monopoly, combined with taxes on other essentials, such as iron, meant the government had complete control over vital resources that literally kept the empire running. If you were a peasant, life was hard, but if you were in the government's good books, you might get a little salt ration, a tiny slice of luxury in a world otherwise dominated by hard labor. It's also important to understand that salt wasn't simply a commodity traded for food or material goods. It was a necessity. The Chinese relied on salt for preservation, whether for meat, fish, or vegetables, in a society that depended on long-term storage to survive harsh winters. Salt was like gold. Without it, people would face famine. And the Han government, seeing this essential need, knew exactly how to leverage it. A fascinating part of the salt economy was its role in the state's military. Salt was needed for the preservation of food supplies for armies, particularly for the expeditions that stretched into the Western territories. If you didn't have enough salt, your army couldn't march through harsh terrain for months. Unable to feed themselves, salt was so critical to military logistics that it said some generals in ancient China were as concerned about controlling salt sources as they were about controlling weaponry. Historians even argue that some military campaigns were started not for conquest, but to seize salt-producing areas. Now let's throw a quirky historical tidbit into the mix. You might be wondering, what does salt have to do with the political savvy of the Han Dynasty? Well, aside from the military control, The state's salt monopoly was often used as a strategic tool for consolidating power. The emperor didn't just tax salt, he controlled its entire supply chain. If you wanted to rebel against the Han, you couldn't just find another salt source. You had to go through the emperor's system, and that's where many revolts found themselves stuck. The state had officers known as salt and iron ministers, who were responsible for overseeing the entire salt trade and making sure that everything ran smoothly. These ministers were as powerful as some generals, and their decisions affected the entire empire. In fact, the salt and iron debate of 81 BCE is one of the most famous political discussions in Chinese history. It was a public debate where officials discussed whether the state should continue to monopolize salt and iron production or allow more private merchants to enter the market. Some officials argued that the state had to maintain control to ensure stability, while others argued for a more free market approach, believing it would increase competition and drive prices down. This debate laid bare the tension between central control and individual freedom, an argument that would continue to echo through Chinese history for centuries. Historians still debate whether this debate was a moment of true political change or simply a political theater to placate the masses. Some view it as the beginning of a decline in government control over the economy, while others argue that it only solidified the Han's grip on power. You've learned how salt fueled the Han Dynasty's economy, kept its armies marching, and consolidated power. But let's dive deeper into what this really meant for everyday people. For most of the population, salt was a tool of survival and a reminder of the government's watchful eye. If you were a peasant farmer in rural China, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was part of your tax burden. The government would often demand that peasants pay taxes in salt, iron, or other vital commodities. This wasn't a small ask, either. Many farmers found themselves working entire years just to meet their salt quotas. Now, imagine being one of those peasants. You've worked long hours in the fields, just to produce enough to feed your family. But now the government comes along, asking for a portion of your grain or livestock as payment for the salt taxes. It's easy to see how this system might feel a little like a constant squeeze. And yet, salt was so fundamental to life in ancient China that many families didn't have much of a choice but to comply. But even in this environment of near-feudal obligation, there were those who tried to circumvent the system, enter the black market for salt. While the Han Empire controlled official salt production and distribution, it wasn't unusual for people to try and find alternative means of acquiring the precious mineral. Smuggling salt became a profitable, though dangerous, business. Smuggling networks would often operate in the shadow of the official salt routes, cutting through villages and towns, moving their illegal wares under cover of night. If caught, the penalty was severe, often including public flogging or even execution, but for those willing to risk it, it was a way to bypass the system and sell salt at market prices that were far cheaper than the state-controlled options. Interestingly, the salt smuggling trade was sometimes viewed with a bit of humor by the lower classes. It was a kind of rebellion that couldn't be crushed completely by the authorities. And it became a kind of folk tradition. Local leaders who could keep salt smuggling under control would often gain the respect of the people, while those who couldn't were seen as weak or ineffective. What's even more surprising is that there are records of some high-ranking officials taking part in the smuggling trade themselves, bending the rules for personal gain. The salt and iron ministers, who were supposed to ensure the salt monopoly was enforced, were not immune to bribery. Historians still argue about how widespread corruption was within these offices, with some claiming that a large portion of the salt taxes ended up lining the pockets of the powerful rather than the state treasury. But even with the underground economy thriving, salt continued to be essential in more ways than one. You'd think salt would just be about food preservation and trade. But it was also intimately tied to religion. Salt had sacred meanings, particularly in the context of offering rituals. Offering salt to the gods was a common practice, believed to ensure prosperity, fertility, and protection. The more powerful figures in society, including the emperor, would offer salt as part of their sacrifices during important ceremonies to maintain divine favor. The act of offering salt wasn't just a gesture of thanks. It was a promise that the relationship between the divine and the ruler, and by extension, the empire, remained intact. Some argue that the economic significance of salt led to its almost ritualistic importance. It wasn't just a substance traded in marketplaces, it was part of the very structure that held society together, literally and figuratively. It's easy to think of salt as just another item on a market stall. But in ancient China, salt was as important as the emperor's command. Without it, there would be no food preservation, no trade networks, no economy to speak of. Historians still argue whether the Han Dynasty's salt policy was simply a necessary evil to maintain order or a brilliant economic strategy that laid the foundation for China's long-term prosperity. One thing is certain, though, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was power. Let's zoom in now on how salt taxes affected social classes. Imagine being a merchant in the bustling market of Chang'an, the capital city, where people from all walks of life mingled, peasants selling produce, traders peddling exotic goods from distant lands, and wealthy officials looking to spend their fortunes. For you, a merchant, salt was more than a commodity, it was a lifeline. However, it also came with a hefty price tag, which meant a delicate balance had to be maintained between profit and the demands of the state. Salt was taxed heavily in the markets, and although you may have been able to sell it for a profit, you still had to pay the government's levy for each chunk you sold. This tax made salt much more expensive than it might have otherwise been. In a sense, the merchants were caught between the government and the customers. Even though your customers needed salt for preservation, cooking, and their daily lives, your margins would be slim as the state's hand was always reaching in. If you were caught trying to avoid paying salt taxes, you would risk confiscation of your goods or worse. As a merchant, you didn't just sell salt in its raw form, you also had to navigate the complexity of selling goods that were tied to salt, like salted fish or preserved meats. The tax burden wasn't confined to the salt itself, but extended to any goods produced using it. So, the price of a jar of pickled fish, for example, was influenced by salt taxes just as much as the salt used to pickle it. Meanwhile, peasants, who didn't have the luxury of managing markets, found themselves stuck in a difficult position. Their connection to salt was indirect, through their relationship with the state, as they were often asked to pay taxes in the form of goods. such as grain or livestock, which were then exchanged for salt. It wasn't that they didn't need salt for their own daily lives. It's just that the cost of salt made it harder to survive. Many peasant families ate their food without the benefit of preserving it properly. Without salt, some foods would spoil faster, and it limited how far food could be stored. This meant that while wealthy families could enjoy salted fish, cured meats, and other preserved foods, the average peasant's diet was much simpler, lacking variety. But salt's impact didn't just stop at food, it was essential for medicine as well. Salt was part of many ancient medical remedies, used for everything from treating wounds to curing digestive problems. It was believed to have cleansing properties and was often used in rituals to purify the body. For those in the lower classes, though, access to medical care wasn't always guaranteed, and if they were fortunate enough to have some salt, they used it not only for preservation but for its healing qualities. In this way, salt taxed social interaction itself. The ability to afford salt, and the privilege of having access to it for both practical and medicinal reasons, defined the social ladder. The wealthier members of society could hoard salt and use it freely, while those on the bottom rungs had to make do with far less, making salt a tool for both survival and power. However, historians still argue whether this system of salt taxation was sustainable or even wise in the long term. Some believe the constant taxing of salt eventually became a point of friction between the government and the people, while others argue that it was an unavoidable tax that allowed the Han Dynasty to maintain its massive bureaucracy and military might. What's clear, though, is that salt taxation was one of the most defining features of Han-era economics. Despite its taxing nature, the system did offer a strange kind of equality. Whether you were a peasant in the countryside or a merchant in Chang'an, the salt tax applied to everyone in the same way. It was an invisible thread that connected all the classes, whether you were paying for it directly or indirectly. It didn't matter. Salt, and the tax on it, became a symbol of the state's omnipresence and power, reminding everyone, rich or poor, of the government's grip on their lives. Now, as we continue exploring the intricacies of the salt tax, let's shift our focus to the logistics and the mechanisms of its collection. This was no simple matter. The collection of taxes was deeply woven into the fabric of society and involved numerous layers of administration. Salt, being so central to the economy and everyday life, needed to be carefully monitored and taxed effectively. The state relied on a well-organized system to ensure that the salt tax was collected and distributed to support the vast bureaucracy and military infrastructure that kept the empire running smoothly. To manage this, the Han Dynasty developed a network of salt inspectors and tax collectors. These officials were tasked with overseeing the production, distribution, and sale of salt, ensuring that every grain of salt was accounted for. This was no easy task in an empire as large and diverse as the Han Dynasty, where goods moved across vast distances and across varying terrains. The roads were filled with merchants transporting goods, often in carts, donkeys, and, on occasion, elephants, who were bringing goods from the northern frontier or down from the southern rice paddies. The task of tracking salt as it passed from one market to another was nothing short of Herculean. Each city or region would have its own designated salt inspectors, officials who were often both feared and resented by the local populace. These inspectors would make their rounds, checking the records of merchants and ensuring that the right amount of salt was being traded and taxed. Their job wasn't just about collecting money. They had to ensure the integrity of the entire salt distribution system. They needed to verify the weight and purity of salt, keeping track of every transaction and ensuring that there were no under-the-table deals or attempts to circumvent the tax. Imagine you're a merchant once again, standing behind your stall, watching as one of these inspectors approaches. His stern face is partially hidden by his wide-brimmed hat. But you know the drill. You're about to have your entire salt stock inspected, weighed, and recorded. If you're caught trying to smuggle or evade the tax, you risk not just a fine but potentially losing your goods. It's a game of high stakes and, more often than not, the salt inspector has the upper hand. These officials were well compensated and highly trained, often with strict orders to root out any salt fraud or dishonesty with little patience for excuses. For the peasants, the impact was equally direct, though not quite as visible. The salt tax was often included as part of their obligations to the state, paid either through a share of their crops or by providing labor for public projects, like roads, bridges, or military service. Many peasants also traded grain for salt in the marketplace, though the price was often inflated by the taxes. For the lower classes, this system felt like a constant reminder of the state's control over their lives. Salt, necessary for life, became a tool of the state's domination, its price fixed not by market forces but by the government itself. But despite the vigilance of these tax collectors, it wasn't a foolproof system. There were always clever merchants or corrupt officials who found ways to evade the salt tax. The underground economy, if you will, thrived despite the best efforts of the state. Smuggling salt out of the regulated areas and trading it outside the taxed market was a common practice. In fact, it became something of an art form. In some regions, there were entire networks of smugglers who managed to bypass the system, paying off corrupt tax officials or bribing inspectors to look the other way. One particularly well-known historical example is the tale of a smuggler named Zhang, who evaded the salt tax for years by using a network of underground tunnels. He became a local legend, a sort of Robin Hood figure. Though his actions hurt the state in the long run, some historians still debate whether his smuggling was purely selfish or if he was, in his own way, protesting the heavy burden placed on the people by the salt tax. Was he trying to redistribute wealth, or was he simply driven by greed? Historians have argued over his motivations for centuries. But what is clear is that he managed to make a fortune while the government struggled to stamp out his operations. The tax system's complexity only increased over time as the empire expanded. The sheer volume of salt required for the growing population, the military needs, and the economy meant that the state had to get even more creative in how they monitored and taxed salt. They instituted what were known as salt monopolies in some areas, regions where the government controlled the salt trade entirely, allowing only government-approved merchants to sell salt at state-regulated prices. These monopolies were designed to curb the rise of illegal salt trade and to funnel all profits into the imperial coffers. But as we explore the mechanics of this system, one question still lingers: did it work? Was it sustainable? Historians continue to debate whether the salt monopoly system was effective in the long term. Some argue that the strict regulation of salt eventually led to inflation and discontent, while others claim that it helped fund the mighty Han military and infrastructure projects. Either way, salt remained a powerful symbol of the state's reach into every aspect of life. No matter where you were in the empire, from the grand palaces to the humble farmsteads, salt, regulated, taxed, and controlled, was always there, a silent force shaping the course of the empire's destiny. Now, let's dive into the broader implications of the salt tax on both the empire and its people. By now, you might be wondering how this seemingly mundane commodity could wield such power. Salt, after all, is just salt, right? But in the Han Dynasty, it was far more than a simple seasoning. It was a tool of control, a symbol of imperial authority, and, perhaps most importantly, a lifeline for the empire's economy. As we've seen, salt taxed and controlled by the government was not just a necessary resource for preservation and nutrition, but a crucial factor in the Han Empire's ability to maintain its strength and stability. The revenue generated by the salt tax flowed directly into the state's coffers, funding everything from military campaigns to monumental construction projects like roads, canals, and, of course, the Great Wall of China. Imagine for a moment the grand scale of these projects. You're standing on one of the high stone walls, looking out over the vast, barren landscape. The wind is biting, but the view is breathtaking. All of this, the wall that stretches across deserts, mountains, and plains, is the result of tax revenue. And salt, harvested and taxed, was a key contributor to making it all possible. But it wasn't just the elite or the central government that benefited from the salt tax. The tax created a certain order within the empire, and the stability it provided was essential for trade, infrastructure, and even social mobility. Those who worked within the salt trade, including the salt merchants and government agents, had access to a level of wealth and power that ordinary citizens could only dream of. For them, salt wasn't just a commodity. It was a means to climb the social ladder. However, this prosperity came at a price. For the average peasant or laborer, the salt tax was a constant reminder of their subjugation. While the elite flourished, the burden of this tax often fell squarely on the shoulders of the common people. The salt monopoly system meant that the people had little choice but to buy their salt from the government at inflated prices. The tax, combined with the need to purchase salt for personal use, food preservation, and even religious offerings, created a financial strain on many families. It wasn't unusual for peasants to give up large portions of their crops just to ensure that they had enough salt for the year. This led to widespread resentment among the lower classes, and historians still argue over the extent to which the salt tax contributed to the eventual decline of the Han Dynasty. While some scholars argue that the burden of taxes, including the salt tax, drained the empire's resources and caused economic instability, others point out that the Han Dynasty's internal struggles, including corruption and infighting within the government, were the primary causes of its downfall. Even within the Han administration, the salt tax system wasn't without its flaws. It created a deeply entrenched bureaucracy, with an entire class of government officials tasked with overseeing the tax collection and distribution of salt. These officials, often bribable, were known for their corruption, and many were accused of pocketing portions of the tax revenue meant for the state. In some cases, this corruption even led to localized uprisings, where disgruntled workers or peasants would revolt against the tax collectors or demand a reduction in the salt levy. Some scholars believe that the resentment caused by such tax burdens may have contributed to the uprisings that eventually weakened the central government. Despite these challenges, the system endured for centuries, becoming a defining feature of Chinese governance. As the empire expanded, so did the salt tax system. The government became more adept at regulating and controlling the salt trade, constantly refining the mechanisms for tax collection. They even implemented a form of salt currency in some areas, where the value of salt was tied to the value of coins. This created a system where salt could be used as a form of payment, creating a further link between the commodity and the empire's finances. As the centuries passed, the Han salt tax became a part of the cultural landscape. Stories and anecdotes about the salt tax were passed down from generation to generation, forming part of the collective memory of the people. There are even accounts from later periods in Chinese history that discuss the salt tax in the context of folklore, painting it as a symbol of imperial greed and oppression. And while the salt tax itself eventually fell into decline with the fall of the Han Dynasty, its legacy lived on. It set the stage for future taxation systems in China and influenced the way later dynasties approached the control of essential resources. Even today, the legacy of the salt tax can be seen in Chinese literature, art, and even political discourse. The idea of salt as a state-controlled resource has been immortalized in countless stories, poems, and plays, often reflecting the deep connection between the people and the land, the state's power, and the enduring nature of history itself. In fact, historians still argue whether the salt tax, in its various forms, was ultimately a necessary evil to support the Han Dynasty's vast empire, or whether it was an overreach that ultimately contributed to the collapse of the once great dynasty. Now, let's step back for a moment and consider how the salt tax fits into the larger tapestry of the Han Dynasty's governance. We've discussed the salt tax in terms of its financial importance, its social consequences, and its enduring legacy. But there's another layer to the story: the cultural and psychological impact on the people of the empire. Salt wasn't just a commodity in ancient China, it was a marker of status, a reflection of the state's power, and, for some, a symbol of oppression. Imagine, for a moment, living in a small farming village on the outskirts of the Han Empire. You're not rich, you're not powerful, but you're getting by, at least. You were until the salt tax came into play. Every year, you and your family rely on a small harvest of grain and vegetables to survive. But now, the salt you once bought cheaply in the marketplace is out of reach. The price has risen, and the amount you need to pay for it is steadily climbing. The salt you once used to preserve your food for the winter is now a luxury you can barely afford. The salt tax didn't just affect the people who could afford it, it seeped into every aspect of their lives, from their food to their daily routines. And this is where the psychological toll began to take hold. Imagine the constant reminder of the state's power and your own place within it. Salt was not just a seasoning. It was a reminder that the government controlled every aspect of your life. Even the most basic of needs. It was a symbol of the hierarchy that permeated every corner of the empire. For the elite and the bureaucracy, the salt tax represented power, control over a valuable resource that was essential to life itself. For the common people, however, salt became a symbol of their own helplessness. Historians still argue whether this was the true purpose of the tax, to reinforce the power of the state and the class divide, or whether it was simply an unintended consequence of a system designed to raise revenue. What is clear, though, is that salt became a vehicle for the state's propaganda, a way to remind people of their dependence on the government, not just for protection and security, but for survival itself. This imbalance, this feeling of powerlessness, played a major role in the ongoing resentment that many peasants and workers harbored toward the government. Even though the salt tax was often seen as a necessary evil to fund the empire's infrastructure and military campaigns, it didn't erase the fact that for the common people, it was another burden, another reminder that their lives were being controlled by forces beyond their control. But the salt tax wasn't just about financial strain, it also became a deeply personal issue. Imagine trying to provide for your family, only to be confronted by the reality that you can no longer afford the basic necessities of life. How does it feel when you can't feed your children properly because you have to allocate a significant portion of your income to salt? How does it feel when you know that the food you've worked so hard to cultivate will spoil because you can't afford enough salt to preserve it? These were the realities that the salt tax imposed on many families across the empire. And yet, despite all the hardships, there was also a strange kind of solidarity that came from the salt tax. Workers, peasants, and even some merchants banded together, exchanging tips on how to cope with the rising cost of salt. Communities formed around the struggle, helping one another survive in a system that seemed designed to push them down. Some even found ways to evade the tax, smuggling salt or finding alternate routes to access it at lower prices. But this came with its own set of risks. Being caught meant severe punishment. And the government didn't hesitate to make an example of those who dared to defy the system. One of the most interesting debates among historians centers around the extent to which the salt tax created a sense of unity among the lower classes of the Han Empire. Some scholars argue that the tax created a common enemy, leading to uprisings and protests that eventually weakened the central government. Others suggest that the solidarity created by the tax simply helped the people get by, allowing them to adapt to the challenges they faced without necessarily rising up against the state. Still, others point out that while the salt tax undoubtedly caused hardship, it also contributed to the continued stability of the empire in many ways. What is certain is that the salt tax was a pivotal part of the Han Dynasty's history, shaping the lives of countless people across the empire. It was more than just a financial system, it was a force that affected the social, cultural, and psychological landscape of the time. For some, it was a source of pride, a symbol of loyalty to the empire. For others, it was a constant reminder of their place in the hierarchy. A reminder that their lives were controlled by forces they could not hope to understand. As we move through history, The legacy of the salt tax lives on in the stories of those who lived through it, in the economic systems that followed, and in the lessons learned from this complex and often troubling chapter of the Han Dynasty. But even more importantly, it remains a symbol of the human experience, the way we cope with hardship, the way we find meaning in struggle, and the way we remember those who lived and died under the weight of taxes, both fair and unfair. By now, you're probably wondering what happened after the salt tax continued to exert its influence over the people of the Han Empire. The tax, while profitable for the government, wasn't without its consequences. Over time, its effect became more pronounced, especially on the social fabric of the empire. Even though the tax provided the government with the necessary funds to expand its military and infrastructure, it did so at a cost. That cost? The growing resentment of the very people who were required to fund the empire's prosperity. As the salt tax continued to burden the lower classes, the divide between the wealthy elite and the common people deepened. The wealthy class, which often held positions of power and influence, was largely unaffected by the salt tax. After all, they could afford to pay the high prices for salt without so much as a second thought. For them, the salt tax was merely another instrument of governance, a way to maintain the empire's power and wealth. But for the common people, peasants, farmers, and laborers, the salt tax was a constant reminder of their subjugation to the state, a symbol of the ever-widening gap between their lives and those of the elites. But it wasn't just the salt tax that created tensions within the empire. The general structure of the Han government, with its reliance on an overly bureaucratic system, further alienated the common people. Officials, often far removed from the daily struggles of the populace, made decisions that seemed disconnected from the reality on the ground. Bureaucrats spent their time scribbling on scrolls, collecting taxes, and managing the empire's sprawling administration, while the people did the hard labor. The salt tax was just one manifestation of this divide. Historians still argue about the extent to which the salt tax contributed to the eventual collapse of the Han Dynasty. Some scholars claim that it was one of the key factors that led to the weakening of the central government, which, in turn, contributed to the dynasty's fall. Others suggest that while the tax may have aggravated existing tensions, it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The salt tax, along with other economic and social pressures, played a role in destabilizing the empire. Over time, the anger and disillusionment of the lower classes would manifest in uprisings, protests, and revolts that challenged the authority of the ruling elites. One of the most famous uprisings that can be traced back to the widespread discontent caused by the salt tax was the Yellow Turban Rebellion. This massive peasant revolt, which occurred near the end of the Han Dynasty, was fueled by years of oppressive taxes and economic hardship. The rebels, who were led by a self-proclaimed great Taoist teacher, sought to overthrow the government and replace the ruling Han Dynasty with a new, more equitable system. The rebellion, although eventually suppressed by the government, was a clear indication of how deeply the salt tax, and other similar policies, had alienated the people from their rulers. Yet, despite the unrest, the Han Dynasty was able to persist for several more centuries. The government, while weakened by the economic strain and social unrest, was still able to maintain its grip on power. But cracks began to appear. And over time, these cracks would grow wider. The salt tax, as well as other taxes and policies, continued to weigh heavily on the common people, and the empire's internal stability began to erode. Even after the fall of the Han Dynasty, the legacy of the salt tax would continue to be felt throughout Chinese history. Successive dynasties would struggle with the issue of taxation, particularly when it came to vital resources like salt. The ways in which these taxes were structured, and the ways in which they impacted the lives of ordinary people, would remain a central issue in Chinese governance for centuries to come. Historians still debate whether the salt tax was an essential tool for maintaining the stability of the Han Empire or whether it was simply an example of an overreaching government trying to extract too much from its people. What is clear, however, is that the salt tax, in all its complexity, played a significant role in shaping the history of ancient China. As you lie there, listening to the sounds of the modern world around you, perhaps it's worth reflecting on the legacy of the salt tax, the struggles of those who lived under its weight, the sacrifices they made, and the way they adapted to the changing tides of empire are all part of the long, unbroken story of human resilience. Like the people of the Han Empire, we all carry our burdens, and though they may change in form, the struggle to bear them remains a part of our collective experience. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of the salt tax, its weight, its impact, and the way it helped shape the history of a people. And, perhaps, reflect on how the struggles of the past continue to echo in the present. Now, with the salt tax firmly settled into the annals of history, let's take a step back and look at the larger picture of taxation in the Han Dynasty. The salt tax was far from the only burden the people had to bear. In fact, taxation in ancient China was notoriously complex, with various forms of taxes levied on different parts of the population, each with its own impact on the social and economic structure. The salt tax was simply one part of a much bigger system that also included land taxes, labor taxes, and tribute demands from the people. The tax system under the Han Dynasty, like many ancient systems of governance, was designed to extract wealth from the common people in order to support the state, the military, and the ruling elite. But while taxes were necessary for the functioning of the empire, the burden placed on the people often seemed overwhelming. The complexity and inconsistency of the tax system created confusion and resentment among the population. It wasn't just the amount of tax that caused problems, it was the way it was enforced. Tax collectors were often seen as corrupt and brutal, using their position to extort money from those who could least afford it. One of the most notorious forms of taxation during the Han Dynasty was the land tax. This tax required peasants to give a portion of their crops to the state, and it could be quite heavy. While the land tax was meant to ensure that the government had enough resources to function, it often left peasants struggling to survive. The wealthy landowners, however, were often able to avoid the tax through various loopholes and exemptions, further deepening the divide between the ruling classes and the common people. Labor taxes were another burden that fell heavily on the lower classes. These taxes required people to work for the state without pay, often on large-scale projects like the construction of roads, canals, and the building of the imperial capital. Laborers were often forced to work under harsh conditions, with little regard for their well-being. The work was grueling and left many workers physically exhausted and malnourished. And, as if that wasn't enough, the government also required people to serve in the military, further depleting the ranks of the peasantry. Historians still argue about how much the Han Dynasty's taxation system contributed to the eventual collapse of the empire. Some scholars suggest that the heavy tax burden, particularly on the peasants, was a key factor in the rise of revolts and uprisings, such as the famous Yellow Turban Rebellion. This large-scale uprising, which took place near the end of the Han Dynasty, was fueled by widespread dissatisfaction with the government's policies, including the high taxes and the social inequality they created. The rebellion, which was eventually suppressed by the Han government, exposed the deep divides within society and showed just how precarious the empire had become. At the same time, other historians point out that taxation in the Han Dynasty was also a tool for strengthening the state. The taxes allowed the empire to maintain a powerful military, support its vast bureaucracy, and fund public works projects that helped the empire grow and prosper. Without the revenues generated by taxes like the salt tax, the Han Empire wouldn't have been able to expand its borders, maintain its infrastructure, or consolidate its power. So, while the taxes certainly had a negative impact on the lower classes, they also played a crucial role in the success and longevity of the empire. There's a delicate balance when it comes to taxation. On the one hand, taxes are necessary for the functioning of a state. They provide the resources needed to maintain order, defense, and infrastructure. On the other hand, when taxes become too burdensome or are enforced too harshly, they can lead to social unrest and rebellion. The history of the Han Dynasty is a prime example of this balance. And the salt tax, in particular, serves as a reminder of how deeply intertwined taxation is with the fabric of society. As you lie there, letting the day's worries slip away, think about the role taxes play in your own life. While you may not be living under the oppressive weight of a salt tax, you're still subject to the demands of the state in one form or another. Taxes are a part of every society, and they help fund the services and infrastructure that make modern life possible. But, just like in ancient China, there's always a fine line between a fair and just tax system and one that becomes a tool for exploitation. So, as you drift off into the calm of the night, let your mind wander for a moment. Think about how history is made up of these small moments, taxes, laws, and policies that shape the lives of the people who live under them. Think about the stories of those who struggled and those who thrived. And remember, whether you're a bricklayer in the Han Dynasty or just trying to make it through the modern world, the weight of the system is something we all carry. The late stages of the Han Dynasty are often painted as a time of grand decline, an empire that once thrived now teetering on the edge of collapse. But, like most great powers in history, the seeds of its decline were sown long before the final blow was struck. The story of the Han Dynasty's collapse isn't just about political turmoil or military defeat. It's also about the consequences of a deeply entrenched system of taxation, exploitation, and inequality. By the time the Han Dynasty fell, The once prominent salt tax had evolved into more of a symbol of the empire's decay than a functioning mechanism for revenue. Initially, the salt tax had been an ingenious method for controlling a vital resource. But by the end of the dynasty, it was seen as a tool of oppression, part of the broader picture of taxation that was draining the life from the peasantry. As more and more peasants were driven into poverty by the relentless tax burdens, the once stable empire began to fracture under its own weight. While the salt tax had started as a clever economic strategy, it became increasingly unpopular as it was used not just to fund the empire's infrastructure but to support the lavish lifestyles of the elite. The wealth of the imperial family and the high-ranking officials continued to grow, even as the common people struggled to make ends meet. Over time, the resentment towards the tax grew, and so did the wider dissatisfaction with the Han government's inability to address the growing disparity between the ruling classes and the common folk. Historians still argue over the degree to which the salt tax contributed to the Han dynasty's downfall. Some suggest that it was merely one element in a complex system of governance that failed to adapt to the needs of its people. Others argue that the salt tax, along with other forms of taxation, was a major catalyst for the revolts and rebellions that ultimately tore the empire apart. The most famous of these uprisings was the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which in many ways symbolizes the culmination of the economic, social, and political stresses caused by the burden of taxation. But, as is often the case in history, the story of the Han dynasty's downfall is not just one of economic factors. It's also a story of human nature, how power and greed can erode even the most successful empires. The salt tax, like the other taxes of the time, was designed to fund the government, but it also became a way to enforce social order. The government used its control over essential resources like salt to maintain power. But in doing so, it created a system that ultimately worked against the people it was meant to serve. The decline of the Han dynasty was a slow, almost imperceptible process. At first, it was hard to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. But as the salt tax and other forms of taxation became increasingly oppressive, it became clearer that the empire was unraveling. The once glorious capital city of Chang'an was soon overshadowed by corruption and inefficiency. The people grew disillusioned, and rebellions broke out across the empire. As we think about the fall of the Han dynasty, it's easy to draw comparisons to the challenges we face today. Like the people of ancient China, we live in a world where systems of power and control shape our lives in ways we may not always fully understand. We live with taxes, regulations, and rules that sometimes feel as if they're working against us. But, like the people of the Han dynasty, we continue to navigate these systems, hoping that we can make it through, that we can find ways to thrive despite the weight of the system. As the night deepens around you, remember this: the rise and fall of empires, of kingdoms, and even of civilizations is not just a story of wars fought and leaders defeated. It's a story of how people live, how they struggle, and how they rise above the forces that seek to control them. And just as the people of the Han dynasty once carried the weight of a system that no longer served them, we too carry the weight of the systems that shape our world. But, in the end, it's not the taxes that define us, it's how we live in spite of them. As we move deeper into the story of the Han Dynasty, it's important to remember that the downfall of any empire is not a singular event. It's a cascade of choices, missteps, and failures that accumulate over time, leading to a point where even the most powerful governments can no longer hold on to control. The salt tax, though central to the economic struggles of the Han, is just one piece of the puzzle. The corruption, the internal political strife, and the inability to address the needs of the people were just as important. In the years following the decline of the Han Dynasty, the empire was divided into several warring states. The loss of central authority and the splintering of the empire led to a period of chaos. But it also gave rise to new ideas and new forms of governance. The warlords and generals who came to power during this period were not beholden to the same bureaucratic systems that had been the hallmark of the Han Dynasty. Instead, they ruled through military force, taking control of key territories and carving up the former empire. But the idea of the salt tax did not die with the fall of the Han. In fact, the practice of taxing salt continued to be a critical part of China's economic system for centuries. But as the centuries passed, the methods of collecting and distributing salt became more sophisticated. The state began to monopolize the salt trade, and the process of taxation became more organized and institutionalized. The salt tax, once seen as a burden, was now just another part of the system, one that the people had come to accept as an inevitable part of life. Historians still debate the long-term impact of the salt tax. Some believe it was a key factor in the rise of the early Chinese state, while others see it as a symbol of the empire's corruption and exploitation. But regardless of how we view it, the salt tax remains a fascinating part of history, a testament to the complex relationships between rulers and the ruled. And in many ways, it speaks to the tensions that persist in our own world between power, economics, and everyday life. But let's pause for a moment. Take a deep breath. You've traveled far through the labyrinth of ancient history, tracing the roots of one of the world's great empires. And in doing so, you've uncovered not just a story of power, but a story of the people who lived under that power, the people who, despite the burdens placed upon them, carried on. They lived their lives, loved their families, and carved out moments of joy in a world that often felt as if it were working against them. And that, in the end, is what has always made history worth telling. As the day fades and the stars begin to blink in the sky above, think back on the journey we've taken through the story of the Han Dynasty. The salt tax, the rebellions, the shifting tides of history. These are the stories that shape us, just as they shaped the people who lived long ago. And in the quiet of the night, as the world settles into rest, it's not hard to see how the lessons of the past still echo in the lives we lead today. So now, as the night settles around you and the world grows still, remember this: history, in all its complexity, is not just about the big events. It's about the small moments, the personal stories, and the quiet persistence of life. The people who lived through it all, who built empires and toppled them, who loved and fought and dreamed, they're the ones who truly define the past. As we come to the final moments of our journey through the Han Dynasty, it's time to reflect not just on the grandeur and collapse of one of history's great empires, but on the small details that made up the lives of the ordinary people who lived through it. The salt tax, The rebellions, the wars and politics, they were all a part of the grand narrative. But it was the simple, everyday moments that defined the reality of life under the Han. Imagine, if you will, the weary laborer who woke up each morning with the same aches, the same fatigue, and the same duties. The salt tax might have been far removed from his everyday thoughts. But it was there, in the background, shaping his life, dictating his struggles, the sweat on his brow as he carried heavy loads of bricks, the tiredness in his eyes after another long day of labor. These were the true markers of his existence. And yet, despite the burden of taxes, wars, and political strife, life continued. The laughter of children, the smell of food being cooked over an open fire, the soft murmurs of family members sitting together at night, these small, human moments were what anchored people in the midst of chaos. Historians often focus on the big events, the emperors and generals, the rise and fall of dynasties. But the real story is in the details, the daily lives of the people who built and maintained those empires. In many ways, the salt tax and the bureaucratic mechanisms that sustained it were just as much a part of the people's lives as the simple comforts they enjoyed at home. Salt, after all, was not just a commodity, it was a necessity. And in that necessity, there was a kind of quiet dignity. A reminder that even in the face of hardship, the people found ways to endure and adapt. As the Han Dynasty slipped into history, the legacy of the salt tax and the system it supported remained. The empire may have crumbled, but the economy it fostered, the structures it built, and the memories of those who lived through it all persisted. And so, as you lie here tonight, reflecting on this ancient history, remember this: empires rise and fall, but it is the lives of the people who carry them that truly endure. The night is calm now, and as you drift into sleep, let the quiet echoes of the past settle gently into your mind. The salt tax, the rise and fall of the Han, the whispers of 1,000 workers, traders, and common folk, these are the stories that shape us, not just as individuals, but as a civilization, as a collective memory that stretches back through time. And so, with the soft lull of history in the background, allow yourself to relax. The gods of the past may have seen everything, but it is you who carries their memory forward, one quiet step at a time. Let that be the legacy you hold onto tonight as you drift off into the peace of sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.